Okay, so welcome everyone. It is 11 a.m. Mountain Time on Tuesday, August 15th, 2023. My name is Lori Peak, and I am the director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to, or welcome you back to, the Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. We've been on a bit of a hiatus for the last couple of months as we've been busy with the in-person natural hazards workshop here in Colorado, which we hosted in July. But now that we're back into August, we are happy to be back online with all of you here at our monthly webinar series. And so before we proceed much further, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that this forum is being recorded, and we will post the presenter slides as well as the video from today's session soon after the meeting today. And you can visit the Hazard Center website at hazards.colorado.edu under our training tab, where you can also find dozens and dozens of past Making Mitigation Work webinar recordings that we hope you will use in your research, practice, or classroom. Today, if you have questions during the 4 presentations that you're going to hear, we hope you will either take to the Q&A or to the chat box. Our guest moderator, Cassandra Jean, will be moderating those questions carefully as we move forward. And then once we've made our way through the presentations, she will then work through the questions and comments. But please do feel free to drop in questions or comments as we proceed throughout the webinar. We also wanted to emphasize for those of you out there who are looking to earn continuing education credits that thanks to our ongoing partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, that for every webinar that you attend, including today's webinar, you can earn 1 continuing education credit. And so we hope that you will reach out to us at hazctr@colorado.edu at the end of the session if you are interested in obtaining credit. And the only requirement is that you attend the live webinar for its duration to receive that credit. So without further ado, now I'm getting ready to turn it over for the main event. Today, we have an opportunity to learn from some of our next generation leaders in the research and applications field from various disciplines and several universities. You're going to hear today about cutting edge, ongoing research with impact in the mitigation, recovery, and preparedness space. And so this webinar today will feature 4 Bill Anderson Fund Fellows who will be presenting, as well as a Bill Anderson Fund alum, Cassandra Jean, who will be moderating the session today to help keep the presentations on time and to moderate the questions and answers. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bill Anderson Fund, it is an organization that was established 9 years ago by the visionary founder, Norma Anderson, to honor and uplift the legacy of Bill Anderson, who was a founding disaster researcher, a longstanding program officer at the National Science Foundation and at the World Bank, and a leading light in the hazards and disaster research field, not only in terms of the work that he produced, but also in terms of the mentorship that he offered to the shining lights of the next generation. And so the Bill Anderson Fund helps to support and mentor and uplift the work of extraordinary next generation scholars as they catch and pass the baton forward to the generations that they are now supporting and uplifting as well. And so with that, I am now going to turn this over to Cassandra Jean, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Washington. And Cassandra is going to take over the mic and the camera and let us know how this special session is going to proceed today. So Cassandra, thank you for honoring us by leading this session today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can listen to and learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you again for tuning into this amazing talk. As Lori said, my name is Dr. Cassandra Jean. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington School of Public Health, finishing up in October. I am a disaster sociologist and researcher focusing on climate, environmental adaptation and injustices, public health disparities, youth and program development, and community and civic engagement. I often work on interdisciplinary teams and specialize in qualitative and mixed methods approaches. As Lori said, I am also a BAF alum, which I credit for the opportunity to engage with, befriend, support, and learn from some of the most incredible up and coming Black and Brown researchers in our field today. So as Lori said, today we have an exciting lineup of lightning talks featuring 4 amazing scholars who will discuss various aspects of disaster and hazards research. These talks aim to share our passion for hazard and disaster studies and inform in a visually captivating way, with each presentation lasting for about 7 minutes. To ensure that we stay on schedule, we will save the questions for our presentations until the end of the session. To kick off today's event, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Yahaira Ayala, Yahaira is a 4th-year PhD candidate at the University of Delaware, specializing in disaster science and management. Her dissertation is titled Reframing Reality, an Analysis of Vulnerability and Resiliency Among Poor African-American Women in Long-Term Recovery Process. She examines the strategies employed by these women in the face of structural and cultural violence. Yahaira has also worked on projects related to disaster recovery, pro-social behaviors during emergencies, and the role of social capital in enhancing resilience. She's a BAF fellow and has served as a 2022 Student Council Vice Chair. Yahaira is dedicated to promoting equity and justice in the field of disasters and aims to address social inequality and challenge colonizing practices in the field. Her goal is to collaborate with historically marginalized communities to develop sustainable recovery strategies. Yahaira's presentation is entitled Reframing Reality, a Demographic Profile of Black Women in Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muting. Thank you, Cassandra. 1 second, what am I doing? Let me know, are you seeing my notes or are you seeing the actual full screen presentation?
We're seeing your notes right now.
Okay. How about that?
That's better.
Okay, perfect. And so before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the University of Delaware Climate Hub for funding my work. And so my objectives for today are to share with you and showcase some of the trends that are visible from the demographic profile that I'm building for my dissertation, and to highlight the implications that this has for the recovery of low-income Black women. Oh my God. Okay, there we go. And so my dissertation looks at these bigger questions around disaster recovery and what we consider to be a vulnerable population, such as low-income Black women. And so it particularly considers these broader issues of both the structural and cultural violence and their role throughout the recovery experience. However, today, and for the purpose of this short presentation, I have these questions that look at demographic data and what can they start telling us about the recovery process, and how can we start identifying, right, through demographic data, the existence of both cultural and structural violence. My dissertation and my research looks at this, it's guided by these bigger theoretical concepts. And I use the concept of recovery not as a way to go back to normal or to build back better, but rather as a post-disaster adaptation process that is encompassing positive and negative experience that are coming together as a result of the event. Of course, this coming together of experiences is going to be heavily informed by identity and the interaction of who we are as individuals with the environment that we live in. right? For the specific case of low-income Black women, their identity and their experiences are going to intersect with the structural and cultural violence. And we understand structural violence as violence or inequities that are built within our social structures, and cultural violence as the changes to the moral color of actions, right? So our ideas and actions that we understand as being normal, but once we look at them, right, we realize that there's nothing normal about them. And so my work is designed to capture multiple forms of data to understand the disaster recovery experiences of this woman. And today I am showing you trends that I'm seeing from 20 interviews, from a total of 29 interviews. And this data is going to be analyzed with along archival data and field observations that were collected. And the way I gained trust from this woman was from volunteering with a local organization in Lake Charles. And that was also a way to recruit some of the participants. And to give you a little bit more of context, most of these women are talking about the damages they experienced from both Hurricane Laura and Delta, which occurred 6 weeks apart during 2020. And of course, they're also speaking in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So beyond thinking just about renters versus owners or percentages, right, of the sample, right, what qualitative data does is that it allows to see these different layers, right, of the different experiences that people are having, like the details within those experiences. And so what I really wanted to emphasize were the challenges that these women are living through, right, as a result of the storms. And within these 20 interviews, it was interesting to hear not only about this woman's experiences, right, regardless of their living arrangements, right? Many of them had incredible damage within their homes, right? But many of them, what really talked about were dealing with insurance companies, contractors that were supposed to help them rebuild their homes, right? In the example here of Sayla, she had insurance and contractors came to her home, but they charged her over $20,000 to remove trees that were outside of the home. Right, this completely ignored the structural damage that her home had sustained during the storm. And so now she's in a lawsuit, right, trying to get some money to fix her home. And again, this was a common occurrence for many of the interviewees that I was talking to. And so during the disaster experience, we're supposed to have these programs and these systems that are in place to design and protect people from the lasting effects of disasters, right? But what we're seeing is that these systems are doing the exact opposite. And so there is a need to rethink or ask why this is happening. Right, the issues with their homes did not stand alone, but were connecting and creating new challenges for many of these women. And so through the data, we're also seeing many women talking not only about health conditions that existed prior to the storm, but conditions that are happening or occurring as a result of the storm itself, right? In the case of Alaya here, she describes developing hives all over her body as a result of both personal challenges that are intersecting with the anxiety and the stress she's feeling from dealing with her insurance company. And so when she showed me her arms during the interview, again, this interview, I don't think I mentioned this, but this interviews happened earlier this year. And so she's showing me the scars that are all over her arms, right, as a result of these hives. And so when we are considering what the systems are doing for disaster affected individuals, we must also consider the new challenges that are arising for them and what this means for their livelihoods. Right, the reality of them also experiencing unemployment, right, as a result of the storm further complicated matters for many of these women, right? Destiny here was economically stable before the storms. She became displaced, and after when she evacuated, she developed diabetes, which left her partially blind and unable to go back to her job. And now she cleans homes, which she described as being like harder work, right? And compared to her old job, but now she doesn't get to earn as much as she did before. And so these stories, again, are not unique to these individuals, but are rather stories that I kept on hearing throughout these interviews. What we're really seeing is that for Black women, the post-disaster adaptation period is full of challenges that are occurring as a result of systemic inequities that are exacerbated by ideas that we have of what is normal, right, after a disaster. And so these conditions that are affected, right, these are fundamental to their well-being. And so we're seeing these effects 3 years after the storm. And many of them, of course, are now going to go back to how they were before the hurricane. And so understanding that these long-lasting effects are happening across this community hints at the presence of violence. But it also invites us to challenge our ideas of how recovery is occurring for disaster-affected individuals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Yahaira. That was excellent work. So next we have Natalie Coleman. So Natalie is a PhD student at Texas A&M University's Civil Environmental Engineering Department. Her research focuses on social disparities and inequalities and infrastructure disruptions during disasters. She integrates physical and social vulnerabilities to promote equitable infrastructure practices. Using data science and machine learning, she analyzes recovery after natural hazards like Hurricane Harvey, Winter Storm Yuri, and Hurricane Ida. Natalie has received prestigious awards, including the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship and the Viles Johnson Fellowship. She actively contributes to organizations like Women in Science and Engineering and the Bill Anderson Fund, while mentoring undergraduates and advocating for research funds. With a passion for inspiring the next generation, she regularly presents to K-12 schools, believing that anyone can become a researcher. Natalie's presentation is entitled Integrating Equity Standards in Infrastructure Management and Restoration. Natalie?
Thank you for that kind introduction, Cassandra. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And let's see. Can everybody see the screen without the presenter notes?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. I wanted to start off this presentation with a quote from the Equitable and Resilient Infrastructure Report by the National Academies, which acknowledges the discrimination and biases that are inherent in infrastructure planning. Now, these discriminations are present in the way that people access, use, and depend on infrastructure like water, power, transportation, and even important services like grocery and medical facilities. So these are exacerbated further in the disaster setting, where people's well-being is constantly being negatively impacted. These statements can be taken into many different perspectives in the planning, policy, and humanities fields, but today I will be framing this conversation through the civil engineering perspective. So my research is really at this intersection with civil engineering, equity, and data science. And each of these components have their own advantages and limitation when it comes to understanding how our infrastructure systems work. So starting with what's most familiar with me, civil engineers and engineers in general have a reputation for relying on quantitative measures of infrastructure management, like life cycle and cost benefit analysis. But as been shown through the research, the impact of these measures tend to benefit certain communities more than others. And despite our best efforts and without malicious intent, these approaches have disproportionately impacted certain communities' response after disasters. But the allegiance of engineers is not to objectivity. Engineers have a professional and social obligation to serve communities, which are often made up of diverse groups and regions. So several institutions have discussed the need to integrate equity into infrastructure management. For example, FEMA has attempted to reduce systemic barriers in our mitigation plans for underserved community, and many equity and ethical actions are being used at the forefront of research studies. So we know that equity is important, but how do we begin to measure and quantify these equity standards? So I propose using data science as a powerful tool for understanding equity in infrastructure. Especially since 2016, the National Science Foundation has sponsored the Harnessing the Data Revolution as one of their 10 big ideas. And this can really begin to bridge the gap between equity and engineering perspectives by bringing in those more quantitative metrics. And this can also be used as a guide and a place of accountability for engineers. So there are many different forms of equity, and the exact definition is still being discussed and understood today, but I will present two different forms, simplified versions of that. The first is social equity, which is referring more to the capabilities of people and the systemic barriers present. So some examples that relate to infrastructure is the ability to own alternative forms of infrastructure like power generators or water filters. The second is more spatial equity, which refers to the direct exposure to these infrastructure vulnerabilities. This can be framed through living in areas of poor maintenance, a closer proximity to urban systems that have more interconnected systems of infrastructure, and even living in areas with more population density, as these areas tend to get more attention in a disaster. So in my research, I really strive to leverage human mobility data. This term might be unfamiliar to some of you. So as a brief example, the data that I have used comes from Spectis, specifically their data for good movement. This can be obtained through third-party apps that have consented and anonymized location information. And a lot of sensitive locations are removed, and these are also aggregated at a larger neighborhood level in order to ensure that people's privacies are protected. I'll be talking a little bit more about the limitations and ethics of using this data later on in the presentation. So this methodology framework is one that I used for a study that focused on recovery efforts after Hurricane Harvey. In the first step, we try to use a machine learning algorithm called k-means clustering to really understand the common lifestyles that people have using important infrastructure services. After that, we try to classify essential and non-essential services. So visits to grocery stores would be considered essential, whereas visits to entertainment centers would be non-essential. And then the secondary clustering really focuses on the differential levels of recovery to these systems. So one person might have a quick recovery to their grocery store, while another may take several weeks to go back to that normal lifestyle. And we really try to connect these different levels of recovery based on the demographic features in the community and where they're living. So in this example, again, using that Hurricane Harvey in Harris County, we were able to identify different clusters of people's lifestyles to these infrastructure services. The map really shows people's dependence on essential services of health and personal care stores, which is just another word of saying pharmacy stores, and non-essential of stores and dealers. So first, this shows us people's dependence in these clusters, and then we're able to see the different rates of recovery. So we have a short, medium, and extreme duration of recovery that lasts between 0 to 15 weeks. And so future research can really start to connect these quantitative metrics with demographic and hazard features in order to get a more sense of the combined vulnerability in a community. So just to reiterate some of the contributions of my research is to, one, really establish the potential of using human mobility data in the first place and understanding people's human relationship to their essential and non-essential services. We also want to recognize the different rates of recovery in order to start creating more equitable frameworks and connecting it to the lifestyle that they're normally using before and after a disaster. So just wanted to close off to just acknowledge the challenges with relying on big data information, which is that balance of representation and privacy. So first, who is the data actually representing? So certain households, such as aging and lower income households, may not have the same level of access to mobility data. And second, what is the level of privacy that must be maintained in order to ensure that the people that we are studying are not being exploited as we're trying to assist them? And I really do believe in this mindset of integrating different fields in order to get a more holistic perspective of how infrastructure is impacting our daily lives. And so I really bring in that engineering perspective, but I've learned so much from collaborations, both in the social sciences and data science. Just thank you to the BAF for providing this platform, and I'm excited to hear the rest of the presenters.
Thank you for that. That was excellent, Natalie. I want to encourage everyone, if you have questions, to put in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll go over them towards the end of the session. So next, we will have Dr. Maggie Leon Corwin, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis at the University of Oklahoma. She earned her PhD in environmental sociology with a certificate in GIS at Oklahoma State University. A sociologist by training, Maggie engages in interdisciplinary research, collaborations at the intersection of energy, environment, disasters, and society. She employs diverse methodological approaches to investigate topics such as carceral environmental justice, collaborative development of sustainable solutions for environmental problems in Oklahoma, and adaptations to infrastructure disruptions caused by severe weather events. Maggie's presentation is an outgrowth of research done as a graduate intern with James Kendra and Rachel Davidson at the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, and is entitled Surviving Winter Storm Yuri, Lessons Learned from Disruptions to Utility Services in North Texas. Maggie.
Thank you, Cassandra. In recent years, we have observed the loss of access to vital utilities like water and electricity due to severe weather events, at times exacerbated by mismanagement and inadequate maintenance. During such crises, the individuals and households impacted become an integral part of the infrastructure system. They conserve resources and even provide their own services when utilities are unable to do so. Their preparedness, endurance, and adaptability play a vital role in the resilience and well-being of the entire community. The February 2021 cold air outbreak, also known as Winter Storm Yuri, was a devastating and unprecedented event that affected residents across the state of Texas. Governor Greg Abbott issued a disaster declaration across all 254 counties for this event, and the storm ranks among the costliest in the state's history. Official reports indicate that 246 lives were lost during Winter Storm Yuri, but it is important to note that these estimates are often conservative. The severe winter weather during Winter Storm Yuri put immense strain on electrical infrastructure, with an estimated 70% of Texans losing power and almost half of all Texans reporting disruptions in water utility services during the storm. As part of a broader research project, we conducted semi-structured interviews on Zoom to capture the experiences of North Texas residents during Winter Storm Yuri. We focused on a region heavily impacted by infrastructure failures, aiming to understand how individuals in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex adapted to and experienced widespread disruptions in critical infrastructure services. We recruited a sample of 22 participants from the DFW Metroplex, with most reporting disruptions to both power and water, some experiencing no household level disruptions at all, and only a few indicating that they just lost power. With this sample, we reached saturation, indicating that we'd gathered sufficient data to understand the topic at hand. Through a two-step open coding process, we identified the following themes. First, we observed incredible innovation in creativity and adaptations. Respondents demonstrated tremendous resourcefulness by repurposing underutilized items to meet their household needs, particularly for heating and warmth. For example, Elizabeth utilized holiday gift sets of warm clothing that had previously sat in a hall closet unused for years to keep warm during the storm. Others, like Max and his family of 5, found themselves using their fireplaces for the first time. Another participant, Patricia, had religious practices that involved candles. When faced with a power outage, she realized that candles could serve a dual purpose. Not only did they provide lighting, but they also generated much needed heat in her home. We also noted the limitations of past experience. Not all respondents were adequately prepared to cope with the disruptions they experienced. Elena, for instance, had an apartment with a fireplace, but faced difficulties because she'd never started a fire unassisted and didn't have any firewood readily on hand. Even those who did have a store of firewood faced challenges due to the prolonged nature of the disruptions, as supplies quickly diminished. What normally lasted an entire winter season in Patricia's household was burned through in just 2 days. These examples emphasize the importance of not only having adequate resources on hand, but also being knowledgeable about their use. We also observed the benefits and limitations of social capital. Respondents relied heavily on their social networks during this crisis. However, challenges arose when considering options like staying with family or friends, especially for those with larger families or multiple pets. Moreover, those who lacked experience driving in inclement winter weather conditions found their ability to access resources available through their networks limited. Finally, we identified stress for all, not just those who lost utility service. Both respondents who experienced direct service disruptions and those who did not reported stress and anxiety during and after the storm. Frustration with entities participants identified as responsible for providing reliable utility services was shared across both groups. Max, whose family of 5 and their 3 pets lost power and water for 7 days, was particularly frustrated with political leaders he identified as responsible for taking care of Texas. He shared, Greg Abbott didn't do his job. He didn't make sure that the power grid was winterized, and went on to state, the fact that our state senator, Senator Cruz, got on a plane to go to Cancun when all of Texas was battling a power outage. You know, hey, if you love Texas, then take care of Texas, okay? If you jump on a plane and hightail it out of Dodge, then you're not taking care of Texas. You're not a representative of Texas. The people who are in our neighborhoods who are, offering up firewood, those are representatives of Texas. Those are proud Texans. Emily, a climate coordinator for a major city in the Metroplex, didn't experience any household level disruptions throughout the storm, but still reported stress and frustration from the widespread nature of the outages. She shared, there's a certain amount of guilt because we can afford to buy a home near a hospital. I get to have power, and there are entire populations and demographics of people in the city that don't. And as someone who works for the city, I feel like we owe them better than this. We could have done a better job of providing shelter and having places for people to go in emergency situations. I think there's a lot of blame to be passed around. This research reveals that while social capital and civil society approaches are crucial for resilience, excessive reliance on social networks can be misleading. Additionally, this research emphasizes the importance of local environmental knowledge and adaptations. Unfamiliar hazards require new knowledge and resources to effectively respond, and we must expand the capacity of communities in the face of new and emerging hazards, including critical infrastructure disruptions. By combining things like direct service provisions, providing backup power sources, and improving building insulation, among other strategies, alongside comprehensive and equitable emergency plans, we can enhance community resilience and better prepare for future climate-related challenges. Together, we can build a more resilient and adaptive society in the face of increasing hazards. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Amazing as always. Last but not least, we have Joshua McDuffie, who's a PhD student in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Vanderbilt University. He is a native of the DC metropolitan area and a proud HBCU graduate of North Carolina A&T State University. His research interests include community resilience, hazard risk education, and equitable infrastructure planning practices. When Joshua is not researching, he can be found reading, exercising, and enjoying time with family and friends. Joshua's presentation is entitled Adapting Disaster Risk Education for Community Resilience at All Levels. Joshua?
Yeah, thank you for that intro. I was trying to find the applause button from my fellow panelists, but I could not. So I applaud you with my words. Does that look good? You know what I'm saying?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I'm Joshua, PhD student at Vanderbilt, as it was said in the Bill Anderson Fellow. So I'll get right into it. So first, I have a personal motivation or background for why I do what I do. If you look at the photo on the screen, it's a picture of road in Pender County, North Carolina. And I have some family origins in that region. There are people that have been there for generations. They first put their feet on the sands of coastal North Carolina in bondage. And they've seen many floods, hurricanes, storms, but through oral knowledge and ingenuity, they've endured and continue to thrive even if we spread out. And as honestly, it's their resilience and their strength that allowed them to weather those conditions. And I'm really here because of them. So in areas like this, flooding can frequently cut off access points. Sometimes you're several miles away from large cities, but there have been several adaptations. They've elevated houses, they've dug ditches, stored away food, and made sure that there was ample land in front of the house. And those are engineering interventions, but things that have come as a result of the knowledge that's been gathered over time. So when floods happen, they're likely to do what they've always done, adapt. They might even go fishing if it's deep enough. It's people like this that have generations of experience with natural hazards that are really at a crossroads, because as the intensity of events increases and the risk change, will that knowledge be enough? So basically, are there more things that they need to know to be prepared? Are there more actions that are required with these new risks that they're facing? So pondering questions like this kind of represented my first call to action. And in studying disasters, I found the opportunity to contribute information to communities like my family and more. So as I mentioned, I'm a civil engineering student. And usually when we're doing our undergraduate studies, we hear words like risk and resilience, but it might look like a culvert or some hill, or just these big infrastructure projects that require a lot of funding and are very visible. And while these are extremely important, there's more to resilience than the government spending and the structures. There's also creativity and adaptations, and there's people. I believe at the core of what civil engineering is we're designing systems for people. So although I'm an engineering student, I believe it's pertinent for me to consider the social implications of our practice as well. So 2 words were mentioned in the title: community resilience and risk education. So I'll just clarify, when I say community resilience, I'm talking about the capacity of a community to respond and recover from an adverse event. And when I mention risk education, I'm speaking of any methods used to improve one's ability to comprehend and plan for risky situations based on the information they have. And because the risks that I deal with are natural hazards, I tend to use the term natural hazards risk education. If you search any terms like these on a search engine, you might see diagrams or colorful graphs, journal articles. But I think what this hints at is the concepts have not yet migrated into public discourse. And my hope is to address this so that the images that come up with these are in public forums of all types. So just broadening the concept of resilience and sort of marrying them. Internationally, there are already several disaster risk resilience programs, disaster risk reduction programs in schools. And many of that was sort of spearheaded through the frameworks like Sendai and Kyoto that highlighted the need for these programs. Yet still a review of US curricula show limited coverage of relevant topics. I kind of attribute this to an over-reliance on gray infrastructure, government spending, and just limited information that can leave communities at risk for natural hazard damages. I think this is even compounded by the apparent gaps in communication between government and community members regarding mitigation and planning, even what they mean. There are many low-cost interventions and available funding opportunities that people just aren't aware of. And they are also not aware of the relative risk that they face and strategies that they might use to mitigate. I think there's a need to expand the practical knowledge beyond the scope of the practitioner. And to clarify that resilience can be the photo on the left, it can also be the photo on the right as well. The first photo kind of, in my mind, represents resilience as an attitude, one that drives someone to heroism or summon strength from within. But on the right, you see practical measures to respond to a flood threat. And I think both of those are important to consider because when you mention the word resilience, there are competing ideas of what they are. So how do we communicate this in a way that people understand and can act on? So for my research plan, I basically want to measure the effectiveness of different educational outcomes associated with natural hazards risk education programs. There are several materials that already exist. And so we want to look at what engineering principles are being communicated, what risk management principles are being communicated, and what's required based on conversations with practitioners and community members. What's required knowledge for them? Like, what do they need to know? And the goal is to really highlight the role that curated programs can have in informing people and encouraging positive behavioral changes. So that may mean packing an emergency bag. It might mean creating a communication plan with community members. And what might these programs even look like? Primary school, it might mean through play and games or even comic books, you're communicating information that they go home and share with family. For secondary students, secondary school students, it might be connecting it to real world problems that they're starting to encounter and think about. And even in adult education, you may have a workplace training, or you may have someone come in and speak with senior citizens. You really want to see what's effective. How can we sort of package these things for different communities based on their needs? And does it lead to behaviors associated with resilience? Basically, what are the need to knows at each education level? So how can this make a difference? Ideally, communities with limited resources can create a cost-effective package of interventions that can move the needle on their efforts to build resilience at a household level and collectively. And I think this can also encourage civic engagement at several levels. This may be volunteerism, community planning, hearing sessions for capital improvement projects. But ultimately, thinking long-term, this is a significant step towards developing capable leadership at all levels and growing the workforce, as well as pushing the needle on people that are interested in the well-being of their community. I personally believe it's my responsibility to promote a culture of awareness and to help inform people about what they need to know to operate in the natural and man-made systems that we inhabit, and to share that knowledge with the most vulnerable among us. I think this is just one of the many ways to do that. And I'll leave it there. So thank you.
Phenomenal, phenomenal, phenomenal work, Joshua. Thank you to everyone, Natalie, Maggie, Joshua, Yahaira, for your presentations, for all of your work, and for making this space to educate us and to share, your research. So now I want to open up the floor in this space to everyone in the audience to engage in conversations and questions with our panelists. So feel free to put it in the question and answer box or in the chat box. I will start off with Laura Hansen, who said, "These research efforts are so fantastic. Will each of the speakers be willing to share their contact information in case practitioners want to get in touch?" So yeah, I encourage everyone to put your email addresses in the chat and for everyone to engage with our panelists, build community and everything. We have Brianna Cash here, who I'm assuming this is for Natalie. What is the collection method of the Spectus mobility data? Is it sourced from cell phone or commercial telemetry data? Have you done any analysis to look at how representative the SPECTUS data is of the population?
That's an excellent question. So with the human mobility data with SPECTUS, it's obtained from third-party apps that you would use on your phone. It is anonymized, and there is a level of consent involved. So none of the data that we use is at an exact user level. It's all aggregated at a neighborhood level. Some minor noise is applied, and then they have their own privacy policies and protections just to make sure that that is ensured. As far as representation, my study personally did not do a direct analysis with the Houston population. However, there are studies out there, and I'd be happy to share them as like information after the session that does do like a comparison analysis with the demographic informations of cities and the representation of SPECTUS. But it is important to acknowledge that there is that limitation that higher income households and the younger generation tends to use mobility data more. So there is a need to just acknowledge that sort of overrepresentation, especially in areas that are more urban populations. They also tend to use this type of data more. You have the same issues if you try to use social media data or Twitter data in your analysis. So I hope that answers your question, and I'm happy to share those resources after the session.
Thank you for such a full answer, Natalie. And Brianna, I encourage you to, connect with Natalie. We have Marianne here who said, can you share more about what disaster risk education worked with who? Oh, I'm sorry, what disaster risk education worked with who? Thank you for all your wonderful work. I believe this is for Joshua.
Yeah, so it is purposely broad, and the reason for that is you have formal forms of education and non-formal forms of education. And I think this is actually the type of thing that can stretch over many years, but hopefully what we do is, for example, if I look at primary school, so K-8 education, and I compare or look at the curriculum and what they're being exposed to at a certain age, being able to look at that and then say, these are topics that they are learning. This is how we can incorporate these concepts that the community has said is relevant for their survival and practitioners have identified as being relevant for their survival and adaptation. And we can introduce those in different ways to them. I've seen some interesting ways that that's being done. Video games have been developed as a way to have students learn and explore what it means to pack an emergency bag or to respond in the midst of an event. I've seen comic books. So there's a lot of interesting ways, and more so it's like being able to tell someone, if you are trying to engage with this particular population, these are some methods that you can use that have been shown to target these needs for the community.
Thank you for that, Joshua. I don't know if this is family, but you have a lot of affirmations in the chat. Great job, everyone. This information is critical and necessary in preparing for and responding to disasters. We have one for Maggie from Mary Painter. Did you get any information or feedback on what respondents said they needed before the next emergency freezing event? And did they express a want for a better electrical system or supplies, et cetera?
Thank you for that question, Mary. Yes, that was absolutely something that we heard quite a bit throughout the interviews. There was a lot of focus on grid fortification and grid resilience, particularly with the politically oriented and very emotional tenor to that. There was also a lot of really clear tangible needs and ways that folks indicated that they were attempting to fortify their own households and communities individually in terms of things like obtaining a generator, making sure that the next winter they had more firewood on hand, but also things that are a little less tangible, including investigating different ways that they can increase their own knowledge on how to do things like start a fire. There were several lifelong Texans who had only used fireplaces for decorations before Winter Storm Yuri and realized very quickly that they needed to build up those skills. Does that answer your question?
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. Yahida, there's a question for you. Can you speak more about whether the women in your sample discussed disaster experiences prior to Hurricane Laura? I'm interested in understanding the impacts of repeated disasters and how the women you studied have responded to those over time.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So yes, a lot of them did talk about previous disasters that had occurred to them. More prominently, they spoke about the ones that had impacted them the most, right, or their families, right. We're also seeing that because both hurricanes happen very close to each other, they really impacted them in their recovery efforts. That's what I'm specifically looking at. But during this time, I had a lot of women talking about the hurricanes, COVID, the freeze that they experienced. I think during one of the hurricanes, there were like tornadoes developed. So that also they were talking about, all these things that were happening and basically within the same year, right? Which for them was really hard and really difficult, right? In making sense of them. When we're looking at longer time, again, what they're talking about the ones that impacted them the most. And they are talking mostly in terms of what is going on, what is present at the moment, right? Because to them, a lot of them are still trying to make sense of them, of the events. A lot of them are still trying to recover. So that's what we're seeing.
I also have a follow-up question from Lori Yahida, if you have the space for it.
Yes.
Lori says, thank you, Yahida, for the presentation. This is very compelling. I wonder if you have an example of a program or policy that could potentially be changed or developed to address these deep-rooted forms of violence that your work addresses.
Yeah, so for example, thank you, Laura, for that question. And I think that's a really good question. I'm looking in the presentation at 3 different things, right? That we could talk about on and on about what is going on with the issues that they're facing, right? So when we're seeing what we're seeing is that for many of them, in terms of their homes, mitigation, insurance as a mitigation measure isn't enough, right? Because there's no accountability for these insurance companies to pay out or from the constructors to actually do the work that they're supposed to do. Right. And so even things like that, understanding that we need more accountability, right? If we're going to continue to use insurances, right, as forms of mitigation or preparedness, in terms of healthcare, right? People need access to healthcare, right? Regardless of their age, and we usually, or sometimes we don't think about those things as being directed or being part of the disaster process, right? But it's really important that people have access to healthcare, right? Or where we see people are struggling to find employment right after a disaster. And so what forms of economic support can we provide, right? And overall, really what this gets at is that there's a need to focus away or to drive away from forms of capitalist economic systems, right, that are focused on overproduction, or for people to put themselves, by the straps, or that sort of thought. And so, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So I'm going to pose this question by Marianne, and any one of the panelists are welcome to answer. Says, Maggie and others, do you have suggestions for how we might rely on and respect respect experiential knowledge better? Someone mentioned that engineers and others might rely on scientific knowledge more.
I can start real quick. So I think something that is echoed in both my presentation and Joshua's presentation is this idea that engineers are more reliant on certain measures, whether that's because it's just the way that things have been, or it's just framed as being more efficient. I think it really just starts at the educational level. You know, engineers go through 4 years of undergraduate experience, plus going through a fundamental of engineering exam, 4 years of work experience, professional engineering. And so I know that in our exams, there is a portion of ethics that is being addressed. And I think if there's really that culture of education and understanding of those fields, I think that that might be able to help, which I think Joshua can talk more about, that bringing in that education for engineers in general. But I think it really is just being more exposed to different types of knowledge, taking the time to really listen, keeping an open mind and understanding that the way that you have done might work to a certain point, but isn't applicable in all cases.
Yeah, I just want to underscore, I mean, yes, +1 to everything that Natalie just said, but also Marianne, in your question, I think that part of the answer is there also, I think it really starts with respect. And I think that engaging in the research process with a lot of respect, not just for the science and the method and your colleagues and collaborators, which I'm going to plug Converge here, just in terms of, I think one of the ways to do that is through these interdisciplinary collaborations, but also just engaging with folks who are on the front lines of these crises, engaging them with respect, I think is essential to that.
I honestly think a lot has been touched on with the previous two answers. I think I'll just add and say, I think we're all in our own way working towards merging different spaces of knowledge and having it build upon each other. And education is definitely a big part of that, like on both sides. So that means getting the terminology to match, or that means understanding we don't need to be experts in every field, but having fundamental knowledge about how these people might approach a situation in such a way that can make it easy for us to sit at a table and speak the same language. And so that takes work on many sides of the table. So that means the engineer needs to be able to go up to the community member and ask them their experience and how they deal with said hazard, knowing that maybe their answer is not what's recommended in the manual, but being able to connect and say, these are, what you did here is actually, it's good in some way. Here's some ways that you can improve it and make it even better. And likewise, just some terminology that practitioners might use that might be helpful just to sit down and get that vocabulary on the same page. So communication is always going to be a big part as well.
Thank you for such insightful responses, for all of your presentations. Thank you again. I encourage everyone to throw affirmations in the chat, and thanking our panelists for the time and the space that they've provided for us. We're now almost done. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lori for our closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Cassandra, thank you so much. And just echoing your words, hoping that everybody on the webinar can offer their affirmations in the chat. And please know that we know we weren't able to get to all of your great questions and comments, but we will post those and any written responses from these extraordinary presenters up on the Hazard Center webpage for this particular session of the Making Mitigation Work webinar series. And a huge virtual round of applause and applause with our words to echo Joshua, to Cassandra for the leadership and moderating with this session, and to Yahira and Natalie and Maggie and Joshua for these outstanding presentations and the rigor of your research, and also the expansiveness of the vision and the inclusive nature of your work. It truly, truly makes a difference. And with all gratitude and respect to the Bill Anderson Fund and Executive Director Nania Anderson for the leadership with the organization. So just to wrap this session up today, another reminder to those who may be seeking continuing education credits, please do reach out to Katie Murphy at hazctr@colorado.edu so she can make sure that you get your certificate for today and that your credit is counted towards your continuing education efforts. We also want to ask everyone on the webinar to please hold the date for next week or next month, excuse me, on Tuesday, September 12th from 11 a.m. to noon Mountain Daylight Time. We will be back here for another session of Making Mitigation Work, and we hope you will visit us at hazards.colorado.edu and go to our About Us tab, and you can sign up for further updates or update your subscription preferences. And so with that, we're going to start end where we started today, with gratitude for our presenters, for our moderator, for the Bill Anderson Fund, for the leadership in this field with cultivating the next generation of scholars of color and leaders in our hazards and disaster research and practice field. And great gratitude to each of you for showing up today for the webinar. I hope you learned something new, and please remember to take care of yourself and others. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye.